In this presentation, we'll look at instance variables, constructors, and methods. These are the nuts and bolts of defining classes, the blueprint for objects. So what is a class? Let's review. In object-oriented programming, or OOP, a class is a model of something in the real world and also a blueprint for objects. For example, public class person is defining two attributes, a string for the name and an int for the age for this person. So every person that we create will have a name and an age unique to them. In whatever program you're creating, a person will have two fields, or these are also called variables, that define what a person is. So a string for the name and an int for age. The person class can also define the behaviors of a person. These are the methods. A person could say hello, eat some food, walk around, etc. A person object is an actual instance of the person class. It would have the actual values of the variables declared by the class. It may help to think of a class as a custom data type. Instead of a double or int type variable that contains a number, a class is a bundle of variables and methods and specifies a new type. A class is a way to bundle multiple variables and methods that work together to define a particular type of thing. What if you worked at a large company, writing software to keep track of your employees? Would you make variables to store the info for every person? Person 1 name, person 1 salary, person 2 name, person 2 salary. Well, of course you wouldn't. You would define an employee class and create multiple employee objects. An instance variable, also known as a field, sometimes called properties or attributes. The instance variable is a variable that belongs to an instance or an object of a particular class. They differ from local variables in that they belong to an entire class or object, not to a particular method. Local variables are those that exist inside of a particular method. A class should declare its instance variables right below the class header for clarity. Remember that a variable's scope is always inside the innermost curly brackets. Local variables only exist within the methods that they're declared in. Instance variables have a scope for the entire class. Instance variables are declared in the class, initialized in the class's constructor, more on this later, and exist to store the state of an object. An object is an actual instance of a class. The state of the object is stored in its instance variables. Remember that instance variables are different from local variables due to their scope. Local variables belong to individual methods, yet instance variables belong to the entire class or object. So in our class, string name and int age are called instance variables. These variables describe what it is to be a person. This is our custom data type that we created. You could think of a person as an abstraction of a real person in the real world. Note how they occur outside of any methods, but inside of the class. So the class is defined by this opening curly bracket and this closing curly bracket. So these variables can be accessed by any method. What is a constructor? A constructor is a special method with no declared return type and the same name as the class. An example of the constructor method, given a person class defined previously. So this method that you see right here in its entirety would go inside of the person class. The constructor header is public person, and this is the parameter list, a string n and an int a. And these are used to initialize instance variables. Name is declared as an instance variable in the class, and n is used to initialize it, and a is used to initialize age. A constructor's job is to initialize the class's fields or instance variables and create a new object in the computer's memory. As you've seen, the class only declares its fields directly below the class header. The constructor assigns them values and creates a new object. The fields or instance variables name and age should be on the left. You are giving values to these variables. The parameters in the previous example, string n and int a, will go on the right. The constructor is initializing the name and age instance variables using the value of the parameters when creating a new object. Wherever you see the new Java keyword, you're calling a class's constructor and creating a new object of that class. A constructor's job is to create the object and initializes the object's instance variables. Things to remember about constructor methods. Constructors are the only methods without an explicit return type. Constructors must have the exact same name as the class. Constructors initialize instance variables and return a reference to the object, created behind the scenes by Java. A reference is basically the location or address of where the object is stored in memory, such that you can refer to it whenever you need to. The reference returned by the constructor can be stored in a variable of that type. More info on the next slide. Constructor methods behind the scenes return a reference to the newly constructed object. You can save the reference into a variable. So person P would be the variable that would point to the new object. New person Charlie 15 is creating a person object named Charlie with an age of 15. And if we ever want to access this object, we can just do that with this variable P. The person type variable P in red stores a reference to the object created by the constructor method call in green. Anytime you want to refer to the newly created object, you can do that with the P variable. For example, to change the age, print the name or call a person method. You can also make anonymous objects in red below whose references aren't saved into variables. This technique won't be very useful at this point. More info on why this is useful next year in AP Computer Science A. So here we have a print statement, and you can print information about Charlie. This would print 15, as this person is being constructed to have an age of 15, and then we're asking that object to give its name, or I'm sorry, to give its age. The constructor method call Charlie, person Charlie, comma 15 does create a person object. However, the reference isn't saved in a person variable. You won't be able to refer to the object again later in your program because we didn't assign it to a variable. Adding instance methods. A non-static method written inside a class is referred to as an instance method and will automatically exist in every object the class produces. An example of an instance method that might go in the person class might be public void say hello. Notice that we didn't include the word static. We have a print statement that says, hello, I am name. Note the absence of the static keyword. We'll discuss what static means later. For now, remember that your methods no longer use the static keyword. An object, a specific instance of a class, will have all the instance methods defined in the class. Methods can be considered the behavior of that type. Think of them as verbs. For a theoretical cat class, it makes sense for the class object to have a meow method, as it is a behavior of a cat. Here's the full example. Public class cat has a string for the name and a string for the breed. In the constructor here, we see that it takes in a string for the name and a string for the breed called N and B, and it uses those to assign the value to initialize the value of name and breed. And we have an instance method, and when you call it, it'll say meow. In the previous example, note that the name and breed variables are at the top level, right below the class header. Remember, a variable scope is always between the innermost curly brackets. It makes sense then that name and breed can be used anywhere in the program. In the meow method, for example, the variables name and breed are the cat class's instance variables, also referred to as fields. Remember, these variables describe what your class is, or the state of your class. Making multiple constructors. Recall that a constructor's job is to initialize the instance variables declared in a class. When making a new object, it's quite possible and generally really useful to have multiple constructors in a class, such that you can make an object of that class, given what you know. A constructor with no parameters is called a default constructor. A default constructor's job is to initialize instance variables to default values. When you know you want an object of that type, but you don't know yet what the values of the instance variables should be. Here's an example. Consider the following bank account class. Public class bank account has two fields, string name, double balance, has a constructor that takes no parameters. When its parameter list is empty, it's called a default constructor. For the name, we're just going to put NA for not applicable, and the balance would be 0. Here we have a second constructor, and its parameter list has one string for n, which means that we'll use n to initialize the name of this object. Making bank account objects, more on this later, based on the constructor that's called. So bank account A uses the default constructor to create the object, and bank account B uses the one parameter constructor to create its object. If you were to print the name of A, it would print out an A for not applicable. And if you printed the name of B, it would print Ron. You may recall from other methods labs that you can have multiple methods with the same name, for instance, substring. As long as the parameters of the method are different in type or in number, Java will call the method that matches the parameters provided. This is referred to as method overloading. Constructors are methods, though they're special methods, and can be overloaded just like regular methods. For example, a cat class. Cat class might have a default constructor as well as a constructor that takes a name. As long as the methods have different types or names of parameters, Java will know how to tell them apart. A review of multiple constructor terminology. Default constructor is a constructor with no parameters. Its job is to initialize the instance variables to default values. For example, public class or public cat. Secondary or parameterized constructors. This initializes the instance variables to the values supplied by the parameters. So this constructor for the cat class has a string n and a string b that will define its name and breed. Method overloading. Having more than one method with the same name but different parameters. We would call that different parameter lists. Constructors are special methods, but they are still parameters. They are still methods. Videos are a thing too. For those of you that prefer watching to reading, the below videos offer good introductions to OOP, classes, constructors, etc. The author of these videos does not name variables per Java conventions and introduces a couple of concepts that we don't use for some time, but the videos are generally excellent. If you're going into a technical field like computer science or engineering, you better believe you're going to do lots of reading.